There's a big difference between knowing the rules and intentionally breaking them versus having no idea what the rules are and just blundering your way into a circumstances that you just could not foresee. Yeah, I think that's an important distinction, because I think that I know the rules pretty well, but sort of intentionally choose to break many of them. But I do think I do know them. I mean, I've read Freedom of the Hills, I've read all the books over the years, like How to Rock Climb, all the classics. But now I just intentionally choose to ignore most of it. Actually, so it's funny, at events over the years, I've probably had like a half dozen people ask me to sign their copy of Freedom of the Hills. People ask you to sign whatever. But whenever I sign Freedom of the Hills, I pretty much always sign, like this is great to a point, or like learn this so that you can ignore it, or random like variations of the theme. Whereas like this is a great thing for you to learn, but you should not apply it too wholeheartedly. It's like don't take this as dogma, because it's like a good foundation, but you don't need all of this. I think a great example of that is the modern prevalence of simul-climbing. Like sort of for high-end climbing, like simul-climbing now is not really textbook, but it's just accepted, it's done, it's relatively safe, it's like it's a normal strategy, but it's just not in the book. Certainly not by the book.
Simul-climbing is such a good example of that, because if you are to Google, anchors, best anchors, like there's a cajillion things come up of all the different things you could be doing with your anchor management and all this stuff. But then if you actually, it's harder to actually find a solid system for simul-climbing, like a modern system for it. That's actually like, you got to go kind of deeper down into the Google results to even find that information, which is kind of wild. I mean, I don't think simul-climbing is like crazy prevalent, but it's certainly prevalent enough that you think that yeah, it's pretty common. It's an advanced technique, but it was so interesting how that's like been one of those things that everyone's like, I don't know if we should encourage this or something, and they don't write about it. But it takes like a few Google hits down to even get to the point where you're finding information about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that the indoor stuff is like it's more of a common genre, whereas yeah, anytime you're going to be simul-climbing, it's some sort of an adventure climb. And one paradox that occurs to me when we're talking about simul-climbing is, if you're in the mountains, it's safer to simul-climb or solo in many situations. So if you pitched something out and you're below a serac that you have to cross underneath, yeah, you're basically saying, here I am, shoot me, versus running across the gully, going fast and minimizing your time exposed to hazards. And I see this a lot too, where people say, well, this is how it should be done. And I'm like, well, that's how it should be done if there's certain parameters set. But one example I'll bring up is I got critiqued because I gave a slideshow and I was showing off-wood climbing and I wasn't wearing a helmet, and it's traditional climbing, therefore you should always wear a helmet. But, I know at least one case where someone had placed a piece of pro, they were wearing a helmet, they turned sideways, the helmet got stuck, he's trying to clip the gear clips to the helmet, and he's yelling, his partner thinks he needs to be on tension and starts pulling on the rope, and it's literally strangling him. And it's one of those things I could see if you took a whipper down a squeeze chimney and your helmet got stuck, it would break your neck. And you did everything right, you were wearing a helmet, but the helmet killed you. I mean, you can't make this shit up. It's like I'll see it and I go, wow, like I could never have thought this up. Like Hollywood could never think up a scenario like this.
That's the real value, I think, in reading Accidents in North American Mountaineering, is that you might want black and white answers, like always make this kind of anchor, always do whatever. But when you read the book, and especially when you read it over multiple seasons, you start to see that it's all gray area. Because I always personally broke it into categories of, this is a terrible thing that befell people versus these people made a terrible mistake. And of course, there's a bit of gray area in between that as well. But it's like when you read enough of them, sometimes just terrible things happen, where like people are doing everything right and they just get hit by a rock that was like spontaneous rock fall, and then it's epic, But then sometimes you're like, what an idiot. I can't believe that person did that thing. Like, that is so bad, and then there's this huge spectrum in between. And I think that it gives you a sense, like basically it just helps you with statistics, because otherwise you think of climate accidents as only what you've heard happen to one of your friends or you've like heard through the grapevine. But when you read the book enough, you realize that there's this huge array of things that can happen in climbing, and to some extent it is a numbers game. It's like you just see that we're all numbers. I don't know. I've always really liked
Yeah.
accidents in North American Mountaineering. It's like,
Yeah, and the thing we try to do is, we probably like look at maybe 300 accidents a year, like every single accident that gets sent in or reported in some way or another. And, we'll take like 100 of those and make it into these narratives. And, these narratives are these bite-sized little stories. So, yeah. And, to your point, like I used to sometimes read these things and I'd be all, oh my God, these people are such idiots. And I even, as I'm editing, sometimes have that feeling. But the lucky thing about being in this editorial position is I think back and I go, wait a minute, this person was a total idiot, but didn't you do that too? You just got away with it, Pete. So, it's really humbling in a way because I get to think back and go, wow, like, yeah, I remember when I did that, I put in a crappy belay and my partner had to take, but quickly got back on the rock. And so didn't pull me off the cliff, stuff like that. So, yeah.
That's why the best part of this whole book this year, Pete, I think, is in this Cathedral Peak write-up. Maybe you guys saw this. It says, the climbers humbly said that they were, quote, incompetent, exhausted, ill-equipped, and cold. And it's like, normally you can't really like say that about people, but it like came from the climbers themselves. And I think it actually takes like a pretty like introspective person to admit, like I was super out of my element and I never should have been up there. Because usually we try to be like, well, this happened and those are all reasons. But like at the end of the day, it takes a lot to be like, I was totally like out of my depth.
Yeah, I think like for that person to make that quote unquote confession, that's the type of person who is really going to learn from their mistake. I mean, I think there's so many definitions of what is safe out there in the climbing world. There is a right way, a very safe way to do things, but based on our experience and the things that we have to do or do in the real world, sometimes we forget. And
I was thinking about all the sort of official ways that you're supposed to climb and then all the ways that I climb now. Because like my aspiration nowadays is to reach the top of a cliff with no gear left on my harness and then just sit behind some rock and belay my partner up. Because if you wind up with a whole bunch of gear left over the top, you're sort of like, oh, why'd you carry it all the way into the mountains and all the way up the mountain? You're like, who cares? You should just like sit down on something and belay. But like, obviously that's not what's taught in any kind of book. But, it's kind of habit now and it works and it's great. And I don't know. You're just like, it seems like the real safety issues are when you're choosing not to do the thing that is textbook, but you just can't be bothered.
Yeah, I was talking to Lauren the last time we were speaking in preparation for this interview, and I go, well, there's the front I have to put out there as the editor of this book, and then there's the things I know I have to do and do in order to climb the things I want to, and it's there's so many different standards out there, to your point, that I think, yeah, I just think being attentive and competent, like those are the two things one has to possess. And a lot of the accidents we see here is one, yeah, people being inattentive, or two, they're getting in situations where they're not competent.